entering the 20th week of what was supposed to be a 5-week war with Iran, but understanding the history of one of the longest running continued cultural civilizations in the world, along with like India and China, helps inform like how did this happen. And there's a lot of misconceptions about how the Islamic Revolution happened. Like people seem to think the CIA was involved. They weren't, but they are responsible, just not in the way that you might think. And people seem to think that people at the time like wanted the Islamic Republic. That's not really true either. They just didn't want the Shah, okay, who was a dictator. But the real story of all of this begins like in the 7th century, whenever Arabic conquestors conquered all the way from North Africa through Persia. And as they conquered, a lot of Arab people moved, a lot of people adopted Arabic as their language, not in Iran. They did switch from Zoroastrianism, the traditional religion, to Islam, but they didn't become Arab. Iranians aren't Arab, okay? They're Persian, and they speak Farsi, which is a totally different language. Why they didn't assimilate in that cultural regard? Well, it's a function of Iran being largely mountainous. It was like hard for Arab conquestors to move there. And then also they were already a very literate society. They always have been. They're an extremely highly college-educated society to this day, one of the most educated. And so they're not Arab. That's a fundamental like reason they have contention with the countries surrounding it. They're also a different type of Islam. They are Shiite, where most of the countries around it are Sunni. And that's a difference in like the lineage of Muhammad, like who you believe the appropriate successor to him was. But also Shiites have a very structured clerical system, especially in Iran, like where these local Shiite leaders were like tax collectors or judges or local leaders. And the Shah was imposed by a 1953 CIA-led, MI6-led coup. That's true, but people conflate that with the 1979 revolution. Different, okay? The 1979 revolution caught the CIA completely off guard. You're assuming a level of competence that they didn't have. There was a 1978 CIA report that basically said, the Shah's great, and he's fine, he had cancer, he was dying, and was like totally unaware of what was going on the ground. So was the CIA, because like they were in a pre-revolutionary stage, and that report explicitly said like, there will be no Iranian revolution, like they're not in a place. Totally wrong, clearly. And this Shah had fundamentally, like, he was a dictator. People, like, seem to conflate him as, like, a good guy because he was, like, a benevolent dictator. Guys, he still oppressed democracy and, like, repressed dissent violently. And his secret police kind of rid the country of an organized political opposition. That's important because what didn't he rid the country of were mosques? Because you can't. It's a religious function in a largely religious country at the time. So that's what Khamenei, this mid-level Islamic cleric, relied upon, was the anger that local Shiite clerics, because the Shah was coming at their power, he relied upon that anger to get people behind his vision, and there was really no organized political opposition because the Shah had destroyed it, okay? So the CIA is responsible in a sense of putting the Shah, who then people associated as a Western puppet, and they didn't want, they associated the West with this dictatorship. They were responsible in that sense, like that their impact flows downstream, but they didn't lead the 1979 revolution. It was different. And the 1979 revolution was a function of like this anti-Western imperial sentiment, largely against the British, honestly, even more than Americans. Like the hatred of America from the Ayatollah arose later because Americans like wouldn't speak to this rising leader because it totally caught them off guard. And then that miscommunication and those like diplomatic flubs like resulted in this chasm that is seemingly insurmountable between the Islamic Republic and its government and America. But yeah, just incompetence. But the revolution was like an opposition to the Shah, to this anti-Western sentiment, like the Shah's secularization was unpopular. The industrialization had resulted in wealth disparity. So there were all these young men moving from rural communities to the major cities. They were living in slums. They saw all this Western oil money. They weren't getting a piece of it. That angst among young men culminated in these protests that eventually overthrew the Shah. But they were led by Khamenei, this religious leader in exile who then came back. But they were also led by Marxists, and they were led by liberal democratic leaders, people who wanted a secular democracy. They were led by students. They were led by the merchant class, like business owners who were important. But because there was no organized political opposition, because the Shah's secret police had systematically destroyed that, the religious leaders became the most powerful, and then they systematically rid the country of these other forces who had allied with them in an effort to rid the Shah and establish a democracy. And instead, what got established was an Islamic republic. Now, it's not a democracy. Okay? Republic, it's not a democracy. It's led by the supreme leader, who's the Ayatollah, who's an Ayatollah. He is the chief religious leader. He is the chief government leader. All roads end with the Ayatollah. Beneath him are like a guardian council, clerics, expediency council, clerics, a president who is elected, but like the people who are allowed to run are selected by the supreme leader. So like a lot of Iranians don't even participate because it's not a free and fair election. And the problem is that after years of repressive Shah rule, Then years of even more repressive Islamic theocratic rule, like secret police, moral police, this IRGC, which is like Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a network of patronage that controls the military, controls industry, you can't really get them to be against the government because they are so fundamentally entrenched in the government and benefit from it. And now they've also, earlier this year, there were protests and the government killed between 7,000 and 40,000 people. There is no opposition, okay? So, a regime change doesn't make sense when there's no one to take the place of the current government. That's an impossible task. Iran is an impossible country to ground invade because it's so mountainous. And so you just can't regime change if there's no plan. There's no plan. And whenever you kill the leaders of the top, it's literally structured to withstand that. It's like a hydra. You cut off the top and there's 20 heads to replace it, each more radical than the last. So the last government, when they killed Khamenei, the supreme leader, his son took over, who hasn't been seen since the bombing. He apparently was in charge now, but he was injured. He hasn't been seen, not on video, not at his father's funeral earlier this week, just in written statements, even though all the rest of his family went to the funeral. So he might not have even been in charge. We might not even know who's in charge. But we do know one thing. They're even more radical than the last. And wow, what a tough feat, because the leadership was pretty darn radical, guys, pretty darn radical. One of the most repressive regimes in the world, ranks at the bottom of every human rights score. There are mass killings, there are public hangings, there are morality police that will beat women if they are not hijabbed in appropriate context, although a lot of brave Iranian women fight back against that. But understanding this is a story about continual foreign intervention that festered and was awful, and then also a dictator who destroyed the opposition and allowed something like this to happen. And so now the structure of the entire system, this patronage network that has existed for 50 years, is almost impossible to get rid of. Fundamental diplomatic flubs where the West had literally no idea this was coming somehow because they had no understanding of what was going on the ground in Iran in the 1970s has resulted in this giant chasm. These countries around it have fundamentally different cultures and religious beliefs than Iran, making there be constant tension. And now Iran controls what's called the Strait of Hormuz, which is where 20% of the world's oil comes. So that's a big deal.